Sienna Adams hated delivering to the big mansions up in Crestwood Hills. Too many gates, too many fake smiles, and way too many people who looked at her like she didn't belong there. But business was business, and her family's dry cleaning shop couldn't afford to lose the new contract. So there she was, gripping a stack of freshly pressed shirts as she rang the bell at the biggest house on the hill. The iron gates had opened automatically when she pulled up in her beat-up van, and now she stood in front of a massive glass and stone mansion that looked more like a luxury hotel than someone's actual home. She glanced down at the clipboard to double-check the address. Yep, 237 Crestwood Drive. The door swung open, and for a second, Sienna forgot how to breathe. The man standing before her wasn't what she expected. No suit, no stiff butler, just him barefoot, in gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt that clung to his chest like it was made for him. Tousled dark hair, deep-set eyes, and the kind of jawline you didn't just see, you felt. "Hey," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You're here for the laundry?" Sienna blinked. Yeah. I mean, yes. Delivery for Mr. Dorian Thorne? That's me." He reached for the stack, but she held it tighter, remembering protocol. "I need a signature." He grinned no, smiled, a real one, and took the clipboard. "You're new." It wasn't a question. Sienna nodded. "First week." "Welcome then," he said, handing it back. "I don't usually get to see the person behind the starch and steam." She laughed softly. "Well, I don't usually deliver to places with a koi pond in the driveway." He glanced over his shoulder. "They're not koi. They're golden trout." She raised a brow. "Of course they are." Dorian laughed, and for a second she forgot about the heat, the time, and the fact she had 4 more deliveries to make. "I'm Sienna," she said. "I'm Dorian," he replied. "But you already knew that." She nodded, backing toward the door, trying not to trip over the marble steps. "Nice meeting you." "You too." "Be careful with that van. Security gets twitchy when people park too long." She waved, climbed into her van, and drove off before she could let her brain catch up with her hormones. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Dorian stood at the window long after she left, watching her taillights disappear down the hill. 3 days later, she was back. Another delivery. Another awkward drive up the winding hill. But this time, he was waiting outside when she pulled up. "You timed that," she said as she stepped out. "I was hoping it'd be you again." Her heart did a stupid little flip. "We rotate schedules. I just happened to take this one. Then I'm lucky." Sienna stared at him. "Do you always flirt with your laundry delivery girl?" He tilted his head. "Only the ones who call me out on my koi pond." She laughed despite herself, handing over the fresh dry cleaning. She remembered the protocol this time, but he didn't offer the clipboard. Instead, he nodded toward the house. "You want a tour?" She blinked. "Of the house? Unless you're in a rush." She hesitated. She was in a rush. But she also hadn't been invited into a mansion before by a guy who looked like he belonged in a magazine. 10 minutes, she said. He grinned. "Come on, then." She followed him through the grand glass doors into a foyer that looked like something out of a movie. Marble floors, a chandelier the size of her bedroom, and a staircase that curved like it belonged in a Disney castle. "Wow," she muttered. "It's a little much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Came with the job." "What job is that?" she asked. "Tech stuff. I started a company. Sold it. Started another one." "Didn't sell that one." Sienna blinked. "So, you're like a millionaire." He shoved his hands in his pockets. "I guess. I never really counted." She gave him a look. "You have golden trout." He laughed. "Fair point." They wandered into the kitchen, sleek, modern, with appliances she didn't even recognize. He offered her a drink. She took a sparkling water, trying not to look too impressed. "You always this friendly?" she asked. "Only with you." She rolled her eyes. "That line probably works better on people who don't iron your shirts." He leaned on the counter, watching her. "You're different. Because I'm not impressed by chandeliers?" "No," he said quietly. "Because you're real. Everyone else who comes through that door wants something. You just want to do your job and get out." She finished the water and stood. "Well, I should go. I've got 3 more stops. I'll walk you out." They reached the van, and for a second there was silence. Then he spoke. "Come to dinner Friday." She froze. "Dinner?" "I'll cook," he added quickly. "Nothing fancy. Just food and conversation." Sienna stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely." Her common sense screamed no. but her heart whispered yes. Fine. One dinner. But if you serve golden trout, I'm leaving. He laughed. Deal. Friday came faster than she liked. She wore a simple black dress and felt instantly underdressed the second she stepped through the door. He was waiting in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair messy in a way she was starting to realize was just him. You look incredible, he said, eyes lingering. She swallowed. You didn't do all this for me, did you? He gestured to the table candles, real silverware, wine glasses. I did. Sienna sat down slowly. You're ridiculous. Maybe, he said, pouring wine. But I like you. Her heart skipped. Dinner was perfect. Steak, roasted vegetables, bread he baked himself. They talked for hours about her family's business, about his first startup, about how lonely money could be when everyone around you only cared about it. Do you regret it? She asked, leaning back. The money? No. But I regret letting it build walls around me. People stopped seeing me. And I stopped expecting them to. Sienna was quiet. But you, he said, eyes locking with hers, you saw me day one. She didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. He walked her to the van again. This time, he didn't reach for the door. I want to see you again, he said. She looked up. Dorian. I know it's fast. I don't care. I haven't felt like this in a long time. Neither have I, she admitted. He smiled, gently reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Then don't say no. She didn't. And when he kissed her, soft and slow, under the glow of the porch light, Sienna knew this wasn't just a fling. Something real had started. Something she hadn't seen coming. She delivered laundry to a mansion. And the millionaire who lived there, he was already falling for her. Sienna didn't usually wake up thinking about a man. Especially not one who lived behind gates and had a wine fridge larger than her entire kitchen. But as Saturday morning sun streaked across her ceiling, she lay there staring at it, the memory of Dorian's mouth on hers still vivid, his voice echoing each time she blinked. She had deliveries to make, errands to run for her father, and a few invoices to file before noon. But her pulse was still tangled in the slow burn of last night's dinner. She didn't even remember the drive home, just the taste of roasted garlic and the way he'd looked at her like she wasn't just someone passing through his life, but someone who might actually belong in it. She didn't answer his call that afternoon. Not because she didn't want to, but because something inside her buzzed with nerves she couldn't name. He was too much, too handsome, too kind, too everything. By Monday, she had convinced herself it was a moment, a bubble. A flicker of something that wouldn't survive the light of day. Then he showed up at her shop. She was hunched over the counter with a seam ripper, fixing a customer's jacket lining, when the bell above the door chimed and his voice filled the room. Is this where the magic happens? Her head snapped up. Dorian stood just inside, a bouquet of white tulips in one hand, a paper bag in the other. He looked completely out of place, surrounded by steamers and racks of pressed blazers. But he didn't seem to care. Are you stalking me? She asked, setting the jacket aside. Possibly, he said. Or maybe I just wanted to see where you disappear to when you're not making my laundry smell like cedar and victory. She stared at the tulips. Those for me? No, I brought them for your sewing machine, he said. Yes, they're for you. She reached for them, inhaled once, then looked at the bag. And that? Lunch. I thought maybe you hadn't eaten. She narrowed her eyes. This is very presumptuous. He leaned on the counter. I'll risk it. They sat in the back room, on mismatched stools between bins of buttons and measuring tape. He'd brought sandwiches from a French deli she couldn't afford, and some kind of sparkling lemonade that made her feel like she should be wearing heels and pearls. Why tulips? She asked between bites. They're hopeful, he said. They show up even when it's cold. Always reaching for light. She paused. That's a weirdly poetic way to talk about flowers. He shrugged. Maybe I'm a weirdly poetic guy. She gave him a sideways glance. You don't seem like it. Because I wear sweatpants and build apps? Because you live in a place that echoes when you talk too loud, she said. Dorian laughed, then looked around the cramped room. This feels more like home than my entire house. Sienna didn't respond right away, but something in her chest shifted. She wasn't used to people like him seeing value in places like hers. After lunch, he helped her carry a heavy box of starch packs to the back shelf. She tried to stop him, said he'd ruin his shoes, but he just grinned and started moving things like he'd done it 100 times. Her father returned from a delivery halfway through and gave Dorian a long, unreadable look. "You helpin' out or just loitering?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Dorian crossed the room and extended a hand. "Helping. I'm Dorian. Sienna's boss," her father said, not taking it. "Friend," Dorian corrected softly. That seemed to soften him. The two shook hands, and after a brief, awkward silence, her father nodded and went into the office. Sienna folded a stack of slacks and kept her head down, heart racing. "You okay?" Dorian asked. "Yeah," she said. "He just doesn't like surprises." "I'm not trying to be one," he said gently. She looked at him then, really looked. "I know." When he left, he didn't kiss her, just touched her hand, briefly, like a promise tucked between fingers. She watched from the window as he walked down the block, ignoring the stares he got from the bakery owner and the florist next door. That night, she dreamed of tulips and the smell of his cologne on her skin. By midweek, he'd sent 2 more bouquets, peach roses and blue hydrangeas, and left a note with the second that simply said, "Just because I can doesn't mean I expect anything. I just want to know you." She didn't know what to do with that. With him. So she invited him to her brother's birthday barbecue on Sunday. It was chaos. Kids running around with sparklers, her aunt screaming about the potato salad, her cousin's boyfriend trying to DJ from a cracked iPhone. When Dorian showed up in jeans, carrying a bottle of wine and a tray of gourmet cupcakes, the entire backyard fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then her uncle yelled, "Who's the movie star?" and everyone laughed. Sienna thought he'd panic, that he'd find an excuse to leave. But he didn't. He jumped into games with the kids, held her grandmother's hand as she told him stories about her garden, and even helped her brother fix a broken latch on the fence. "You're not what I thought you'd be," she whispered as they stood in line for grilled corn. "What did you think I'd be?" he asked. "Polished, arrogant, bored. I'm all of those things," he said with a grin. Then he turned serious. "But not when I'm with you." Later, after the sun dipped and the string lights flickered on, he pulled her aside near the garage. "I know this is moving fast," he said, "but I haven't felt this grounded in a long time." She searched his face. "Grounded? Like I can breathe. Like I'm not pretending." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing her wrist. "You don't treat me like I'm fragile or dangerous or a trophy. You just see me." Her throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond. So she leaned in, pressed her lips to his, and let the world spin without her for a while. By the time they parted, her heart was racing. "You're going to ruin me," she whispered. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'm the one who ends up ruined." The following week, he asked her to come with him to a fundraiser. Black tie, downtown. Nothing like her world. She almost said no. But then he showed up at the shop with a dress bag and a pair of heels in a box tied with a satin ribbon. "I took a risk," he said. "But I think this color will look incredible on you." She stared at the package, touched by the gesture, unnerved by how easily he wove his life into hers. That night, he didn't pick her up in a car. He sent a driver. The vehicle was sleek, black, and silent inside, with chilled water bottles and a mini speaker playing soft jazz. The dress fit perfectly. The heels made her legs look a mile long. And when she stepped out of the car and saw Dorian waiting on the steps of the hotel, tuxedoed and radiant, her breath caught. "You're stunning," he said when he took her hand. "You're not so bad yourself." Inside, the fundraiser was a swirl of champagne flutes and whispered names. People stared. Some whispered. A few even smiled too wide, trying to place her. "Don't worry about them," he said, guiding her to their table. "They're just trying to figure out why I look so damn happy." The night stretched into something surreal, dancing under chandeliers, laughing at jokes whispered behind napkins, sharing glances that said more than words ever could. Afterward, in the back of the car, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "This is a weird life you live," she said. "I know. I don't fit in it." He turned, brushing his lips against her hair. "You don't have to. I'll build a new one." She looked up. "You can't just build a life around someone you barely know." "I'm not," he said. "I'm building it with you." And for the first time in a long time, Sienna let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, someone like her could belong in a world like his. Not because she changed, but because he saw her exactly as she was, and never once asked her to be anything else. The first time Sienna saw Dorian lose control was at the gallery auction. She had agreed to come with him hesitantly because he promised it would be small, low pressure, just a few artist friends and some overpriced modern pieces. But the moment they stepped out of the car and into the soft hum of cameras flashing along the sidewalk, Sienna realized he'd either lied or seriously underestimated what counted as small in his world. Inside, the gallery was a glass-walled labyrinth glowing under chandelier-shaped light installations that pulsed like breathing stars. The air smelled like eucalyptus and champagne, and the people moved like they were born on velvet carpets. Dorian held her hand tightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak as they passed a group of sharply dressed men who nodded at him with the kind of recognition that came with deals signed in silence. A woman with glossy black lips and a clipboard intercepted them near the entrance to the bidding lounge. "You're late," she said, not unkindly. "They're waiting." Dorian gave her a brief nod. "Tell them I'll be 10 minutes. The woman glanced at Sienna, her gaze quick and assessing, and then disappeared into the crowd. Sienna stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "You told me this was casual. It was supposed to be." He exhaled. "I didn't realize my former partner would be here." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. The tension in his shoulders said enough. "How long do you need?" "Not long," he replied, his jaw tight. "There's a piece I donated that's being auctioned. I have to pretend I still care." He led her past a sculpture of a twisted steel prism and into a quieter alcove where the noise thinned out. A staff member handed him a bidding paddle. Dorian took it absently and turned to her. "Wait here." Sienna nodded, watching him disappear through a curtain of white linen panels. She leaned against the wall beside a 6-foot canvas splattered with gold leaf and stared at it blankly. "You're Sienna, aren't you?" The voice came from her left. A man stood there, tall, with a silver watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. He had the kind of face that aged well, sharp lines, expensive grooming, and eyes that didn't blink enough. "I am," she said slowly. "I'm Bennett. I used to own half of what Dorian has now." She said nothing. He gave a dry chuckle. "He's different with you. I've never seen him look nervous before." "I don't think he is." "He is. And that makes you dangerous." Sienna crossed her arms. "You always introduce yourself by insulting people?" He leaned in slightly. "I'm warning you. This world eats people who don't know how to play in it." "I'm not here to play," she said. "I'm here because he asked me to be." Bennett smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then I hope you're smart enough to know when to walk away." Before she could respond, Dorian reappeared, his face tight and unreadable. He didn't acknowledge Bennett, just reached for her hand and guided her out of the alcove. Back in the car, silence stretched between them. "Who was that?" he asked finally. "Bennett." Dorian's knuckles went white on the armrest. "What did he say?" "That I make you nervous." He didn't respond right away. "I do?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "Because you're the only thing in my life I didn't plan. And the only part one can't buy back if I lose." She didn't speak. Instead, she reached for his hand. He didn't let go. The next morning, he showed up at her apartment. She lived in a walk-up above a bookstore, the kind of place where the floors creaked with every step and the windows had to be propped open with books. She hadn't expected him to ever see it. It wasn't a place you brought someone whose shoes probably cost more than her rent. But when she opened the door, there he was, holding a paper bag and 2 mismatched mugs. "I made coffee," he said, "and brought croissants from that place you said you liked." She blinked. "You remembered?" "I remember everything you say." They sat on her fire escape, legs dangling over the edge, the city stretching out below them in crooked lines and distant sirens. He looked around at the peeling paint and the ivy creeping in from the wall next door and smiled. "I like it here," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Seriously, it feels like a place where real things happen." She laughed. "Like burnt toast and overdue bills?" "Exactly." He leaned back against the railing, eyes squinting into the sun. "I used to think the only way to be happy was to keep building more money, more control, more distance from the version of me that used to eat instant noodles for dinner. And now I think happiness might be something you find when you stop trying to buy it." She turned her head. "You're getting philosophical. I'm getting honest." That night, she brought him to the rooftop of her building. It wasn't much, just tar paper, a few stray lawn chairs, and a view of the skyline if you stood on the air conditioning unit. But it mattered to her. It was where she went to think, to breathe. He stood beside her in silence, one hand in her back pocket, the other tracing slow circles on her hip. After a long pause, he said, "I've been offered a position on a board in London." She felt her heart slip. For how long? A year. She stared at the horizon. "And you're going?" "I don't know." She turned. "Do you want to?" "I want you." "That's not an answer." He exhaled. "I want both." "But I don't know if I can have both." She stepped away, the wind lifting her hair. "You can't ask me to follow you, Dorian." "I'm not." "Good," she said. "Because I won't." He moved closer. "I wasn't going to. I just needed you to know." She nodded. "Now I do." They didn't speak again that night. 2 days passed. She didn't hear from him. On the third day, she found an envelope taped to the shop door. No name, no return address. Inside was a key and a handwritten note. No pressure. Just come. "I miss you. D." She stood in the doorway for a long time, staring down at the metal glinting in her palm. When she finally went, it was nearly midnight. She used the key to enter through the side gate, past the garden where the wind whispered through the hedges like secrets. The house was dark, but the third floor glowed faintly. She climbed the stairs. He was in the study, barefoot, glasses perched low on his nose as he read something on his laptop. He looked up, and the moment their eyes met, the tension in the room cracked open. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't either." He stood. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "Of what this means. Of what I'm becoming with you." He crossed the room, closed the distance between them. "I'm scared too," he said. "But I'm more scared of not having you in my life." She looked up at him, the light from the window catching the fear and hope in her expression. "I'm not a part of your world, Dorian. Then I'll make ours." He kissed her like he meant every word. And for the first time in days, she let herself believe it could be true. Sienna stood beneath the glass awning of Dorian's penthouse, staring out at the city stretched endlessly below. The rain had started without warning, tapping gently against the windows, casting reflections on the marble floor behind her. She hadn't meant to stay this long. One night had become 2, then 5, and now she was waking up in his bed more often than her own. Behind her, his voice drifted in softly. "I've been thinking about the warehouse." She turned. He stood barefoot, still damp from the shower, towel slung low on his hips, with a folder tucked under one arm. She hadn't seen that folder before. "What warehouse?" she asked, pulling the sleeves of his oversized hoodie tighter around her hands. "The one on Mercer and 7th. It's been sitting empty for years. I bought it a while back, thinking I'd turn it into a co-working space or something. But that doesn't feel right anymore." She tilted her head. "So what does?" He dropped the folder onto the coffee table and flipped it open. "Blueprints. Renovation sketches. Interior concepts. I thought maybe it could be something for you." She blinked. "Me? A boutique. Not just laundry tailoring, custom design, maybe a showroom one day. You've got style. You've got skill. All you've been missing is the platform." Her heart thudded once, hard. "Dorian, I never asked for that." "I know. That's the point." She stepped closer, looking down at the pages. "You're not serious." "I'm completely serious. I already spoke to a contractor. If you want it, it's yours. You'd run it, name it, design it. No strings." She looked up slowly. "There's always strings." He met her gaze. "Not with me." She sat down on the edge of the couch, mind racing. "You don't even know if I'd be any good at that." "I know you'd be brilliant." She shook her head. "This is insane." He crouched in front of her. "So is falling in love with someone who showed up at your door with a bag of pressed shirts." Her chest tightened. "You love me. I've known for weeks." Sienna reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then promise me something. Anything. Don't build me a kingdom if the second I step into it I feel like a guest." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. "It's not a kingdom. It's a home. And it's yours as much as it's mine." Later that evening, they attended a private dinner at the top floor of a skyscraper overlooking the bay. It was for an investor Dorian had once mentored, a quiet celebration with only a dozen attendees and even more silence between them. Sienna wore a navy wrap dress, her hair pinned back loosely, and tried not to flinch each time someone asked her what she did. "She's building something of her own," Dorian said once before she could answer. And when it's done, you'll all be asking if you can invest. His words clung to her skin longer than the scent of the cologne he wore. After dessert, he excused them early and took her up one more floor to the rooftop where the air was cool and the lights of the skyline blinked like distant stars. She leaned against the railing, letting the night fill her lungs. "I feel like I'm in someone else's story," she said. "You're not," he replied. "You're just in a chapter you haven't read yet." She turned to him. "You always talk like that?" "Only when I'm terrified." She laughed, stepping into his arms. "Why terrified?" "Because I've never had something I couldn't afford to lose before. And now I do." The next morning, Sienna met with the contractor. She spent hours walking through the warehouse, imagining the layout, sketching ideas on the back of receipts, asking questions about plumbing and lighting like she'd done it 1,000 times. Dorian didn't hover. He waited outside, hands in his pockets, watching her make decisions without ever trying to shape them. That night, she brought him to her favorite place in the city, a rooftop greenhouse above an old library, hidden behind a rusted metal door and guarded by a cranky tabby cat. She'd never taken anyone there before. "This is where I go when I need to remember who I am," she said, crouching beside the tomato vines. He watched her quietly. "You don't need to remember. I'll remind you." They stayed there until dawn, talking about things they'd never said aloud before. He told her about the night his father left and the years he spent trying to outrun that emptiness. She told him about her mother's garden and how she'd buried her grief in the scent of lavender and lemon balm. When they climbed down the fire escape, hand in hand, something between them had shifted. Not heavier, just deeper. A week later, the warehouse renovations began. Sienna spent her mornings at the shop with her father, her afternoons at the site, and her evenings curled beside Dorian on the couch, watching documentaries about architecture and arguing over paint swatches. The day the walls were framed, she walked into the space and saw her name printed on the construction schedule, Sienna lead designer. She stared at it for a long time before wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist. "You okay?" Dorian asked, appearing behind her. "I think," she said, voice thick, "this is the first time I've ever seen my name mean something bigger than just me." He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Get used to it." That night, he took her to a rooftop restaurant where the chef cooked in front of them and the wine was poured from bottles wrapped in silk. But it wasn't the food or the view that made her heart race. It was when he knelt beside the table, box in hand, eyes so full of unspoken promises it nearly undid her. "Sienna Adams," he said, voice steady, "I didn't fall in love with you because you changed my life. I fell in love with you because you reminded me who I was before life told me I had to be someone else. You are the first real thing I've ever had. And I want to spend every day earning the right to keep you. Will you marry me?" She didn't cry. She laughed. Then she said yes. The wedding was small, only family, the contractor, and a handful of friends. They held it in the courtyard of the finished boutique, surrounded by the scent of fresh paint and potted jasmine. Her father walked her down the aisle. Dorian wore a navy suit with no tie and kissed her like they'd already been married 100 lifetimes. Afterward, they danced in the empty storefront, barefoot, spinning slowly beneath the warm lights as the guests trickled into the back garden for champagne. "This isn't where I thought I'd end up," she whispered against his chest. "Me either," he said. "It's better." When they returned from their honeymoon a week in a cliffside villa by the Amalfi Coast, the boutique opened. And it didn't just open. It thrived. Because people didn't come for the tailored suits or the hand-stitched dresses. They came for the story. The woman who once delivered laundry to a mansion. And the millionaire who opened the door. And fell in love. Sienna stood barefoot in the boutique's back room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above her and a bolt of silk spread across the counter in front of her. She ran her fingers along the edge, testing the grain with a kind of reverence she never used to have for fabric. The space smelled faintly of cedar and fresh plaster, the scent of something new, something earned. Behind her, the door opened. "I thought you'd be upstairs," Dorian said, stepping in with a box under one arm. "I needed quiet," she replied without turning around. "The interns are reorganizing the inventory wall, and I think they're trying to start a small revolution." He set the box on the table. "Let them. Revolutions make good leaders." She glanced over her shoulder. "Does that mean I'm officially one now?" "You've been one since the day you picked up my shirts and told me I had too many koi. They were trout." He smiled. "You knew that before I did. Which reminds me." He opened the box, pulled out a small, framed photograph and handed it to her. It was a picture of the boutique's front window. In it, her name was etched in gold just above the double doors, the sun hitting the glass in a way that made it look like it was glowing. "Why this?" she asked quietly. "Because I wanted to remember the exact moment I knew you'd built something that would outlast both of us." She traced a finger along the frame. "I still don't know how I got here. You walked, brick by brick." They didn't need to say more. Not about the boutique, not about the months of dust, mistakes, and long nights. That part was theirs, written in stitches and foundation beams. Later that week, Sienna was invited to speak at a local business forum. The boutique's rapid growth had caught attention, and they wanted her to talk about entrepreneurship, creativity, and vision. She hesitated when the offer came through, unsure if she was ready to stand in front of a crowd that would expect polished answers and perfect anecdotes. "What if I freeze?" she asked Dorian the night before, pacing their living room with a mug she hadn't touched. "Then freeze," he said. "And when you unfreeze, tell the truth. That's what they're really there for." She stared at him. "You make everything sound so easy." "It's not easy, but it's simple. You've got something people want to hear because you never pretended to be anything but exactly who you are." The next evening, she stood on the stage of a renovated theater, her palms damp and her heart pounding. But when she looked out at the crowd, when she saw her father in the second row and Dorian beside him with an arm draped over the back of the seat like he'd always belonged there, she steadied. "I used to press shirts and stitch linings," she began. "Now I run a boutique that dresses people for the lives they've always imagined. But the work I do hasn't changed. I still take care of the details. I still make sure every thread matters. Because that's where the story lives, in the pieces people overlook." After the applause, a woman approached her backstage. She was in her 60s, with deep laugh lines and eyes that didn't miss much. "I saw how he looked at you when you spoke," she said. Sienna smiled. "How was that?" "Like someone who would burn down the world if it ever tried to take you from him." She didn't need to answer, because she already knew it was true. The next morning, Sienna found a note on her desk. Dorian's handwriting, slanted and strong. "Meet me at the warehouse. Midnight. Wear something warm." She laughed softly at the instructions. He had a talent for turning the ordinary into something cinematic. At 12 sharp, she stepped inside the old warehouse that had started it all. The boutique was now just across the street, glowing in the darkness like a candle in a glass jar. Inside the warehouse, the lights had been dimmed and a trail of lanterns led her down the center aisle. At the end, Dorian stood beneath a canopy of string lights, a small black velvet box in his hand. "You're late," he said, but his voice was soft, teasing. "You didn't give me a minute-by-minute schedule," she replied, walking toward him. He took her hands. "I've rehearsed this about 100 times. "Then don't rehearse. Just tell me." He opened the box, revealing a ring more delicate than she imagined. He'd choose a vintage rose gold band with a single oval diamond set in a halo of tiny sapphires. Elegant. Understated. Completely her. "I've built a lot of things," he said. "Apps. Companies. Houses. But nothing has ever felt like a home until I met you. You challenge me. You ground me. You see me when I forget how to see myself. And I don't want to keep building unless it's with you." She stared at him, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and joy. "So I'm asking, will you marry me?" She nodded before her voice returned. Yes. Of course, yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, and the moment it clicked into place, the lights above them shimmered brighter as if the world itself had waited for their promise. They married 3 months later in a garden behind the boutique, surrounded by wild jasmine and eucalyptus trees. Her father walked her down the aisle, and Dorian's mother flew in from Paris, tears streaming silently as she kissed her son's cheek before he turned toward the altar. Sienna wore a dress she designed herself, simple, backless, with a train that whispered over the grass. Dorian wore a linen suit with no tie and a navy pocket square to match the ring's sapphires. The vows were short. "I choose you over and over, without pause, without end," she said. "I will never stop building a life where you feel safe, seen, and deeply loved," he replied. Afterward, they danced beneath the stars, their friends and family clapping to the beat of an old jazz band. The cake was lemon and lavender. The first dance was to a song they'd once heard on a rooftop in Rome, And when the lanterns floated into the night sky, Sienna whispered against his neck, "I've never been more sure of anything." He held her tighter. "Neither have I." In the months that followed, their life unfolded in a rhythm that felt both new and completely natural. The boutique expanded into a second location across the city, and Sienna hired a team of designers she mentored with quiet pride. Dorian stepped back from corporate boards, choosing instead to build a foundation that funded women-led startups and design schools in underserved neighborhoods. On Sundays, they cooked barefoot in the kitchen, playlists humming softly in the background. On Tuesdays, she'd leave notes in his briefcase. On Fridays, he'd bring her flowers from the market, never roses, always something wild and unexpected. And on quiet evenings, when the world slowed and the city softened, they'd curl up on their balcony with glasses of red wine and talk about the life they never thought they'd find, the love they almost missed, and the future that stretched before them like a road paved in gold and stitched in silk. One night, as they lay tangled in sheets and moonlight, Sienna turned to him. "You never told me what you thought the first time you saw me." He brushed her hair from her face, his voice low and certain. "I thought, there she is. The rest of my life, standing on my doorstep, pretending she's just dropping off shirts." She laughed, tears stinging her eyes. "I love you. I'll never stop loving you," he said. "Not for a single breath." And he never did.